The morning was cold for October, and the street outside the solicitor's offices at Gray's Inn was busy with the particular unhappiness of those who had come to ask for something and already knew the answer. Cecily Vane stood near the iron railing at the bottom of the steps, her gray wool mantle pulled close against the damp, a small covered basket at her feet. She had arrived early enough to secure a position near the front of the loose gathering of petitioners, widows, discharged servants, a young clerk with his papers in a leather folio, a woman whose shoes had been resoled too many times. Cecily's own shoes were not much better. She had not eaten since the previous evening. The letter in her reticule, the one from Mrs. Hargreaves' solicitor confirming that her godmother's estate had been entirely consumed by debt, was 6 weeks old, and she had read it so many times that the paper had softened at the folds. She was not precisely begging. She had a letter of application, carefully written, asking whether the firm had knowledge of any household requiring a gentlewoman of education as a governess or lady's companion. She had sent 17 such letters in the past 3 weeks. She had received 4 replies. None of them had led to a position. She did not look at the carriage when it stopped at the curb. She had learned, in these weeks, not to look at carriages. They were not for her. She heard the footman lower the step. She heard the creak of a well-sprung door. She heard the coachman speak to the horses in a low voice, and she heard footsteps on the cobblestones, firm and evenly paced, the step of a man who did not slow for anyone. The other petitioners moved, a small collective drawing back and downward, the unconscious genuflection of the dispossessed before rank and income. Cecily moved with them, the same dip of the head, the small bow that had become as habitual as breathing in these weeks. She lowered her eyes to the stone, and the footsteps stopped. They stopped precisely in front of her, and the silence that followed was different from other silences. She raised her eyes. He was taller than she remembered, broader at the shoulder. The dark coat was perfectly fitted, and his cravat was white and immaculate, and there were 12 years in his face that had not been there when she knew it. But the gray eyes were the same. The set of the mouth was the same. That particular stillness. The discipline of a boy who had learned early that feeling was best kept behind glass. She heard herself say it. She had not intended to. It left her mouth before her mind caught it. One syllable. The name she had called him for 6 years in the orchard and the schoolroom, and along the edge of the stream at Ashmore Park. Thomas. Just that. Barely above a breath. He went very still. The footman standing at his back looked sharply at her. The clerk with his leather folio took a discreet step sideways. The October air moved around them, carrying the smell of coal smoke and horse and damp stone, and the Duke of Ashmore stood on a public street and looked at Cecily Vane as though the ground had shifted beneath him. "I beg your pardon," she said immediately, her voice steadier than her hands. "I did not mean to address you, Your Grace. Forgive me." She bent her head again, the proper bow, the correct deferential angle, and prayed that he would walk on. He did not walk on. She had been Cecily Hartley then, her godmother's name, before she understood that Mrs. Hargreave was not her blood relation, but only a kind woman who had taken in a solicitor's orphaned daughter as a favor to the old Duke. She had been brought to Ashmore Park at 8 years old to be educated alongside the household's other young charges, and had stayed 6 years until the second Duchess arrived and the household rearranged itself around its new mistress. She had been 14 when the letter came from the housekeeper, saying she was to be resituated as the household circumstances had changed. She would travel to Mrs. Hargreave in Norfolk. Everything had been arranged. She had not known, when the carriage carried her out of the Ashmore gates, whether the boy who had been her nearest companion for 6 years had been told she was going, or whether he had known and simply chosen not to come down to say farewell. She had not known for 10 years. She had wondered for 10 years. The gray eyes were still on her. The Duke of Ashmore was a man who had learned to be the coldest person in any room, and the word she had said had reached something behind the cold, something that moved behind the glass and pressed against it. "Miss Vane," he said. His voice was lower than she remembered. He knew her name. That was the first surprise. He knew she was no longer Hartley. She raised her eyes again, because there was no use in anything else. "Miss Vane," he said again, quiet and level. "You will come and see me at the house. Not this morning. Tomorrow at 11. It was not a question. To the other petitioners, to the watching footman, to the two gentlemen who had paused on the steps above with their papers, it was a command issued in the easy cadence of a man accustomed to compliance. To Cecily it was something else, something she could not name. She pressed her gloved hands together inside the concealment of the mantle and told herself to breathe. "Your Grace is very kind," she said carefully, "but I am not in any position to impose upon." 11 o'clock, he said, and walked on. If you have ever felt the particular disquiet of seeing someone you thought was lost to you standing whole and alive on a London street, stay a little longer. This story belongs to you. Cecily stood at the railing until the carriage had gone, and then she stood a while longer. She was 24 years old. She had been managing alone for 3 years, first assisting Mrs. Hargreave with her correspondence and household accounts as that lady's health declined. Then, after the death, conducting herself through the legal dissolution of an estate that owed more than it held. She had been refused a position at a school in Bath because she had no certificate of teaching, refused by a family in Norfolk because the father had taken one look at her face and said she was too young and too pretty, and his wife would not thank him for it, refused by 3 London households in succession, for reasons that were not stated, but had something to do, she suspected, with the directness of her gaze and the absence of a respectable household to vouch for her. She was, the season had decided, a nobody from nowhere. She had heard Lady Renmore say it at a drawing-room gathering to which she had been brought as companion to her temporary employer, a widow named Mrs. Pringle, who had a kind heart and a poor memory. Lady Renmore had not lowered her voice. She had been describing the new arrivals to the woman beside her, a narration delivered in the carrying tone of someone who had never learned that walls have ears. "That plain thing behind Mrs. Pringle is nobody from nowhere. Some orphaned nobody the old Hartley woman dragged along. Has no people, no connections, no prospects whatsoever. Quite a sad case." Cecily had continued her work on her embroidery with very steady hands. She went to the house at 11 o'clock the next morning. The Ashmore townhouse in Grosvenor Square was larger than she had prepared herself for, though she did not know why she should have been surprised. She had grown up in a ducal household. She remembered high ceilings and cold corridors and the particular smell of beeswax and old stone. But she had been a child then, and children experience grandeur as simply the shape of the world. She was an adult now, and she knew what it meant. The footman who let her in looked past her left shoulder in the specific way that meant her appearance had been assessed and found inadequate to the surroundings. She gave her name with a composure she had spent considerable effort constructing on the walk from her lodgings and was shown to a morning room, where she waited for 12 minutes with her hands folded and her eyes fixed on a painting of the Ashmore estate from a distance, which she recognized from childhood with a jolt she concealed behind a careful breath. She had not intended to recognize it. She had intended to be entirely composed. She was mostly composed when he came in. He came in alone, which she had not expected. No secretary, no steward. He closed the door behind him, and he stood for a moment just inside the room with his hands at his sides, looking at her with the gray eyes that she had spent 10 years not thinking about. "You are well," he said. It was not quite a question. "I am quite well, Your Grace. Thank you for receiving me." There was a pause. Something moved across his face that she could not name. "Sit down," he said. He said it the way he had once, at 11 years old, said sit down when she had torn her knee on the orchard wall and was being entirely too composed about the bleeding. The same cadence, the same level authority that was, she had always understood even then, not authority at all, but its opposite. She sat. He did not sit immediately. He moved to the window and stood with his back to the glass, and she looked at the middle distance past his shoulder and waited. "I have been trying," he said after a moment, "to understand how 10 years pass." "They pass as years do," she said carefully. "One at a time. You did not write." "I was informed," she said, keeping her voice level, "that the connection had been concluded by the household, and that correspondence would not be appropriate." Something shifted in the set of his shoulders. "I was informed," he said, with the same deliberate evenness, "that you had expressed a preference to return to the country, and that you had asked the solicitor to convey your thanks to the household." The morning room was very quiet. "I was 14 years old," Cecily said. "I did not write any such letter." He looked at her then, really looked at her, the way she had seen him look at a chessboard once, at 12, when he suddenly saw that 3 moves had been laid for him that he had not noticed. "No," he said. "Just that." Another pause. A longer one. "My ward requires a governess," he said. "Harriet is 8 years old and has recently lost her mother, my sister Caroline. She does not speak much at present. The 2 previous governesses left within a month each. I am told she is difficult." Cecily looked at him. "She is grieving," Cecily said. "Yes." He said it quietly, and she heard in it the specific weight of a man who knows something about grief and has not found a way to say so. "I will take the post," she said. "On one condition?" He raised an eyebrow. "You will not introduce me to the household as anything other than Miss Vane, governess. I do not require a history to be invented. I require only that no history be offered." He was quiet for a moment. "Agreed," he said. And then he added, "The position carries £40 per annum, use of the schoolroom and meals. You may begin Thursday." She rose to leave. "Cecily," he said. She stopped. It was the first time he had used her Christian name. It felt differently than she expected, in his adult voice, in this formal room, with 12 years of silence wrapped around it. She did not turn around. "The button," he said. She stiffened. "I beg your pardon. The ivory button, from the blue coat. You kept it." She had no idea how he could possibly know that. She turned. Slowly. He was looking at the small covered basket she had set beside the chair. She had not opened it. He could not have seen. "I kept mine as well," he said. "I have carried it for 12 years, in the left pocket of whatever coat I am wearing." "I thought you had thrown yours away." He said it with no expression on his face. He said it the way he said everything, in the level voice that gave away nothing. But his left hand, at his side, was perfectly still in the deliberate way of a hand that wants to move and has been told not to. "I will see you Thursday, Your Grace," she said. She left quickly, before the composure could crack in the corridor where he might hear it. The Ashmore household received her on Thursday with the well-trained blankness of a professional staff that had learned not to remark upon anything. Mrs. Thorpe, the housekeeper, showed her to the schoolroom on the second floor, a pleasant south-facing room with good light and a cold fireplace, and then to the smaller room adjacent where Harriet sat in a chair by the window. Harriet was small for 8, with dark eyes and a pointed chin, and the particular stillness of a child who has recently learned that the world is unreliable. She looked at Cecily with the frank assessment of a person who has been disappointed before and intends to notice. "Are you going to leave?" Harriet said. "Before I have finished being used to you?" "I intend to stay for as long as you require a governess," Cecily said, sitting down in the opposite chair at a comfortable distance that was not so far as to be formal. "Whether that proves to be a long time or a short one will depend rather more on you than on me." Harriet looked at her for another long moment. "The last one," she said, "cried." "I expect she had her reasons," Cecily said. Harriet was quiet. "Do you like reading?" Cecily asked. "No," said Harriet. And then, "Yes, I like stories, not lessons." "That is an entirely reasonable distinction," Cecily said. She took a small volume of natural histories, one she had carried herself, a childhood book with good illustrations of birds, and set it on the arm of Harriet's chair. And then she crossed to the cold fireplace and began, without asking permission, to lay the kindling. She said nothing else. She did not press. She simply built the fire and sat at the work table when it was going, and took out her small piece of mending, and worked in the afternoon light with the particular quality of presence that is not an imposition. After perhaps 40 minutes, she heard the quiet rustle of pages. She did not look up. She heard Harriet ask, in a voice much softer than the one she had deployed at the door, "What is a bee-eater?" "A bird," Cecily said, "brilliantly colored. They live in warm places. It says they eat bees. They do. They catch them in flight." Another pause. "How do they not get stung?" "They rub the bee against a branch," Cecily said, "to remove the sting before they eat it. They know exactly what they are doing." She heard Harriet absorb this. She did not look up. She kept her eyes on her mending and let the silence settle back into something comfortable. She did not know that the door to the schoolroom was not fully closed. She did not know that the Duke of Ashmore had come to the second floor for reasons he had not examined too closely and had paused in the corridor. She did not know that he stood for perhaps 2 minutes listening to the quiet, the fire, the occasional turn of a page, the small exchange about the bee-eater, and that when he finally walked away, his expression was something that would have been recognizable to anyone who had ever seen a man remember something he thought he had permanently lost. The following days carried a pattern that felt, to Cecily, both precarious and strangely familiar. She rose early. She managed the schoolroom. Harriet, who had reportedly not spoken voluntarily to either of her previous governesses, spoke to Cecily. Not freely at first, not with warmth, but in the small transactional exchanges of a child who is testing a threshold to see if it holds. The Duke appeared at the schoolroom door 3 times in the first week. He always had a reason. The first time it was to inquire about Harriet's progress with her letters. The second time it was to return a book he had borrowed from the schoolroom shelf. The third time, on Friday afternoon, there was no reason offered at all. He simply stood in the doorway for a moment, looked at Harriet, and then at Cecily, and said, "The fire is low. I will send Perkins." He sent Perkins. He did not come in. At dinner on Saturday, which Cecily took in her own small sitting room attached to the schoolroom suite, Mrs. Thorpe brought the tray herself, rather than sending a housemaid, which Cecily understood to be a form of assessment. Mrs. Thorpe set the tray down and straightened and looked at Cecily with the particular directness of a woman who has managed a difficult household for 20 years. "She ate her breakfast this morning," Mrs. Thorpe said. "Both portions." "She was hungry," Cecily said. "She has been hungry for 2 months," Mrs. Thorpe said. "She did not eat before." She left without waiting for a response. Cecily looked at the tray and the fire, and the evening pressing against the window glass, and she thought about a child who had been too sad to be hungry, and she kept all of the feeling very quietly to herself. The invitation to the Dowager's Sunday supper arrived Monday. Cecily read it twice. It was addressed to her by name, in a handwriting she did not recognize, and phrased in the language of polite command. The Dowager Duchess of Ashmore would be pleased to receive Miss Vane at supper on Sunday, in the family dining room, at 7 o'clock. No explanation. She showed it to no one. She would go. She had no particular reason to fear the Dowager, she told herself, except for the clear memory of being 14 years old and handed into a carriage with a small trunk and told that things had been arranged. She arrived at the family dining room at precisely 7. The Dowager was already there, and so was a woman Cecily did not recognize. Angular, impeccably dressed, with the quality of attention of a person who has learned to read a room very quickly. "Miss Vane," the Dowager said. Lady Margaret Ashmore was 60 now, silver-haired, beautifully maintained, and possessed of a smile that offered nothing. "How pleasant. Allow me to make you known to Lady Renmore." Cecily recognized the name a half-second before she recognized the voice. Lady Renmore looked at her with the frank recalibration of someone encountering a person she has categorized and now cannot quite place. "Miss Vane," she said, "are you recently come to town?" "Some weeks past," Cecily said. "And you are companion to Mrs. Pringle, I believe." "I have concluded that arrangement. I am now governess to Lady Harriet." The silence that followed was perhaps a quarter-second too long. "How interesting," Lady Renmore said, and smiled. The Dowager presided over the supper table with her customary grace, and Cecily ate carefully, and spoke when spoken to, and said nothing that could be used. She had learned, in years of managing more comfortable household situations than this one, that the safest table strategy in a room where you do not know the rules is to listen more than you speak, and to give nothing away that will not come back to you with interest. After supper, the Dowager dismissed Lady Renmore with a nicety, and turned to Cecily with her hands folded and her expression slightly changed. "My stepson has spoken to you," she said. It was not a question. "His Grace has been very kind," Cecily said carefully. "He is," the Dowager agreed, with the warmth of someone who has already decided how a conversation will end. "He is a man of considerable feeling beneath the exterior. It has always been his vulnerability." She let that sit. "I should tell you," the Dowager continued in the same pleasant voice, "that I arranged for your departure from Ashmore Park 10 years ago. You will have worked that out, I expect. You were always perceptive." Cecily said nothing. "I want you to understand," the Dowager said, "that it was not cruelty. Edmund was 16. He was already too attached to a person of no family and no fortune, and that attachment would have been ruinous. I was protecting him, as I am protecting him now." She reached for a folded letter on the small table beside her and held it out. "He asked me to give you this," she said. "He found the situation rather more difficult to manage than anticipated." Cecily looked at the letter. It bore the Ashmore seal. She recognized the handwriting on the outer face as Edmund's. She had seen it in notes left for the housekeeper, the particular forward lean of his letters. The Dowager set it gently on the table. "He is to be engaged to Miss Hartwell within the fortnight," she said, with the kindness of a person delivering bad news they have been looking forward to. "It is a matter settled by both families. He is an honorable man, and will not manage the transition well if there is a prior attachment already established in the household. It will be better for everyone if you are gone before the announcement." Cecily looked at the letter for a long time. She thought about the schoolroom. She thought about Harriet asking about bee-eaters. She thought about the ivory button in the left pocket of whatever coat he was wearing. 12 years. And she thought about her own button in its small tin in her trunk upstairs. And she thought about the morning room, and his voice saying her name with all of the 12 years wrapped around it. She picked up the letter and put it in her reticule. "I will be gone by Friday," she said. She did not open the letter until she was back in her own small sitting room with the door closed and the fire burning low. She sat in the straight-backed chair by the window, and she opened it. The seal was the Ashmore crest. The handwriting was his. The letter was 4 sentences. The third sentence was the one that undid her. He had not written release. He had not written the household circumstances. He had written her name, and in between, he had written something she had not expected. He should have come to the gate. He had not come to the gate, and he had spent 12 years understanding what that cost him, and he had not yet found the courage to tell her in the room what he could not put in a letter. She read the 4 sentences 3 times. She read the third sentence 4 more times. She sat for a long time in the chair by the window, while the fire burned down. She had been a nobody from nowhere for so long that she had taken the label's logic inside herself, accepted it as a premise rather than an argument. The old Duke had taken her in as a charity. The new Duchess had removed her as an inconvenience. The season had sorted her correctly. Unplaced, unspoken for, unworthy of notice. This was the truth the world had repeated to her so consistently and from so many directions that she had begun to narrate her own life in its terms. And here was a letter that said something else. She put the letter down. She did not cry. She sat for another quarter-hour in the cold. And she thought about the dowager's smooth voice saying, "He asked me to give you this." And she thought about the handwriting on the letter's outer face, and she thought about 4 sentences that did not sound like a release at all. She went back downstairs. She knocked at the door of the library. It was 10:30. She had not been in the library yet. The schoolroom occupied her days, and she had not been invited. "Come in," he said. He was at the desk, the lamp burning low, a letter open before him, and a pen in his hand that had not been writing. He looked up when she came in, and something changed in his face, a small contraction, as though he had been prepared for someone else. "Miss Vane," he said. "Is Harriet?" "Harriet is quite well," she said. "I'm sorry for the hour." She crossed to the library. She placed the letter on his desk. She said, without sitting down, "Did you write this?" He looked at the letter. He picked it up. He read it. His face changed. "No," he said. He said it very quietly. "I did not write this." He was quiet for a long time, reading the 4 sentences. Then he set the letter down carefully, with the deliberateness of a man managing something he might otherwise not manage well. "My stepmother," he said. "She has your handwriting, as she has many things. She said you had asked her to give it to me, that you were to be engaged to Miss Hartwell." He looked up at her. "I am not engaged to anyone," he said. "I have not agreed to any such thing. The Hartwells have been represented to me as a suitable match. I have met Miss Hartwell twice. I have not offered for her." Cecily stood at the edge of his desk and looked at the letter, and then at him. "When I was 17, he said, "I received a letter from my father's solicitor, telling me you had expressed a preference to return to the country and would not be continuing correspondence." "I know," she said. I believed it, he said. I believed it because I thought that was the more likely explanation. That you were glad to go. That I had not been. He stopped. He set down the pen. I was not an easy child. You were not easy, she agreed. You were worth knowing. The library was very quiet. The fire had burned to red coal. Outside the windows, the London night moved against the glass, the distant sounds of the city, coaches on stone, wind in chimneys. He had been married at 22 to a woman his father had chosen, a match of sense and propriety. She had been kind, he had once heard Mrs. Thorpe say to another servant. Kind and very young. He had not known her well enough before she was gone. He had not been present when it happened. He had been in the north, called away for estate business, and he had come back to a house that had changed its shape around an absence. His daughter had not lived either. He had stood in that changed house for a long time, not knowing where to put his hands. The portrait in the east corridor showed a fair-haired young woman with a mild expression. Cecily had passed it each morning on the way to the schoolroom. She had understood, from the small details in the household's behavior, the way Mrs. Thorpe turned the conversation gently away from the east corridor, the way Harriet sometimes paused at that part of the hall without stopping, that the loss was still present, even after 4 years. There was a letter, he said. He said it to the desk, not to her. I received it when I was at Oxford, a letter that said Catherine had a particular fear of the dark, and that she had been sleeping very badly since her mother died, and that the nurse was old and would not last, and that the children needed. He stopped again. She was not my sister's child then. She was nobody's child yet. I said I would send money. I wrote back that I was unable to come. The lamp guttered once in a draught and steadied. I could not come, he said. I understand that now as the explanation it was. But at the time I chose to come 6 months later, when it had become a different kind of urgency. And by then she had not spoken to anyone in 4 weeks. And he turned the pen in his hand. Caroline chose me as guardian because she believed I would not let duty be the whole of a person's life. I have been proving her wrong for 2 years. You are not proving her wrong, Cecily said. He looked up. Harriet spoke to me today, she said. She asked about bee-eaters. She ate both portions of breakfast. She called you Cousin Edmund at supper. She called me Cousin Edmund. I was not present, but Mrs. Thorpe told me. The stillness in his face was different now from the stillness she had catalogued in these weeks. This one came from the inside out. She had been holding her hands folded at her waist with the composure of long practice. She unfolded them. She reached into her reticule. She put the small tin on his desk. He looked at it for a moment. He reached into the left pocket of his coat and opened his hand on the desk beside hers. A small, worn, ivory button. She opened the tin. Inside, on a small fold of flannel, was its twin. They sat side by side on the surface of his writing desk in the lamplight, 2 buttons from a child's coat, kept for 12 years by 2 people who had told themselves separately that they had no very particular reason for keeping them. I am told, he said very quietly, that I am not easy to know. You are not easy to know, she said. The knowing is worth the difficulty. She was looking at the buttons. His hand moved on the desk, a fractional distance toward the tin and therefore toward her hand beside it, and then stopped. She looked up, and he was looking at her with the gray eyes that had been the same at 12 as they were at 35, that had been behind glass so long they had forgotten what it felt like to be on the other side of it. Cecily, he said. Just that. Her name in his voice was the same thing it had been in the morning room, something wrapped in 12 years of silence, but different now in a way she could feel in her sternum. She did not look away. I am not leaving, she said. He closed his eyes for one moment, and then opened them, and the glass was gone. The Hartwell ball was held 3 evenings later, on a Thursday, in the Hartwells' Mayfair house, and the Dowager Duchess of Ashmore attended in ice-blue silk with her diamonds and the quiet confidence of a woman who has managed a situation to her satisfaction. The ballroom was full. Miss Dorothea Hartwell, 22, dark-haired, polished as fine porcelain, stood at the center of a small, favorable crowd near the west windows, looking in the direction of the door. The Dowager stood to one side with Lady Renmore and Mrs. Forsyth, and the comfortable certainty that the evening would unfold as planned. It had been, on the whole, a well-managed campaign. She had also, as it happened, underestimated something. A piece she had not accounted for. The boy's habit of keeping his own counsel. She had always been able to read his face. She had always been able to manage him. She had done so at 16, when the solicitor's letter had closed the door before it could be properly opened. And she had done so now, at 35. With the forged letter and the governess's accommodating composure in the face of a bad hand. She had not accounted for the button. She had not known about the button. She saw Edmund arrive at 9:20. She saw him speak briefly to his host and accept a glass. She saw him cross the room at the precise, controlled pace of a man who is going somewhere and does not require anyone to notice. She saw where he stopped. Cecily was standing near the wall, to the left of the musician's alcove, in the gray wool mantle that was the best thing she owned and entirely inadequate for the room. She had not been invited to the ball. She had come because Mrs. Thorpe had quietly arranged for her to accompany the Hartwells' own governess, who was an old acquaintance, as an act of kindness that was not precisely authorized. She had not told Edmund she would be here. He had known anyway. He crossed the room in 3 deliberate strides, and he stood before her, and the room began to understand that something was happening. The way rooms do. The slow, collective orientation of faces. Lady Renmore said something, low and swift, to the Dowager. Miss Hartwell looked up from her small crowd. Edmund Ashmore, Duke of Ashmore, took the gray-manted woman's gloved hand and bowed over it, a bow that was not the bow of a duke to a governess, and straightened and said, in a voice that carried precisely as far as it needed to, "Miss Vane is known to me. She is spoken for by me." The room received this. The Dowager's fan stopped its motion. A fraction. A perfectly controlled fraction. The only thing that cracked. Lady Renmore's face did the calculation and reached a conclusion she had not prepared for. Miss Hartwell looked, briefly and honestly, relieved. The murmur that ran through the room was not unkind. It was simply the crowd waking up to something it had been waiting to understand. The Dowager said nothing. She was too skilled to say anything now, when saying anything could only make it worse. She gathered herself, and her silk, and her long practice at managing what could not be managed, and she looked at the woman her stepson had chosen, and for a single moment her expression shifted into something that had nothing calculated in it. Only recognition. The heroine does not gloat. This is what the audience is owed, not a destroyed enemy, but a corrected one. Cecily looked at Edmund. She said quietly, so that only he could hear, "You will have to manage her." "I have been managing her for 30 years, he said. "I am not without practice." There was, at the corner of his mouth, something almost like amusement. She had never seen that before. She stored it carefully. The solicitor arrived the following morning. His name was Mr. Calder, a compact man of 50 with careful eyes, and he came to the Ashmore townhouse at 10 o'clock with a stack of documents that settled, with the particular dry finality of legal language, several matters that had been pending for longer than they should have been. There was the question of the letter the solicitor had sent at Edmund's direction, or believed to have been at Edmund's direction, when Edmund was 18 and Cecily 14. There was the question of how the instruction had been conveyed, and by whom, and what the original document had said. Mr. Calder had, at Edmund's request, examined the relevant correspondence carefully. He spread the relevant pages on the morning-room table. He explained what they showed. Cecily sat across from Edmund and looked at the page, at the handwriting that was not Edmund's handwriting and was not even particularly close to it, and she thought about a 14-year-old girl in a carriage at the Ashmore gates, wondering whether the boy had known she was going. And she felt something that was not anger. It was something older and quieter than anger, the feeling of 10 years being correctly accounted for at last. "It does not require discussion," Edmund said. He said it to Mr. Calder, without looking away from her. Mr. Calder understood, and began explaining the other matter, which concerned a specific provision in the late Duke's will that had been incompletely executed, a trust established for the education and establishment of the children of the household's dependents, which included, by the old Duke's precise wording, the daughter of Mr. James Vane, late solicitor of this parish, taken into the household in the year 1804. "He knew my father," Cecily said. "Your father served this household's legal matters for 12 years, Mr. Calder said. The old Duke held him in considerable regard." She had not known that. She had thought herself taken in as charity. She had not known it was kinship of a different kind, a connection between two men who had valued the same things, expressed in the form of a child brought under a good roof because her father would have wanted her to be. She sat with this for a moment. She thought about the old Duke, whom she remembered as a tall man with kind eyes who had once stopped in the schoolroom corridor and listened to her read a passage aloud and said, with genuine pleasure, that she had her father's ear for language. She had not understood what that meant at the time. She understood it now. The following autumn they were married in the village church at Ashmore, with Harriet as the only attendant, in a yellow dress she had chosen herself, because she said it was the color of bee-eaters, and Cecily had not been able to disagree. Mrs. Thorpe wept. She had been weeping in a controlled and dignified manner since breakfast. The dowager sent a gift and a letter. The letter was brief and contained, in its 4th paragraph, a single sentence that acknowledged, in terms precise enough to be an apology, if one read them carefully, that the connection had been managed in a way that had cost more than she had intended. Cecily read that paragraph twice, and then put the letter away, and did not discuss it further. There were things that could be said, and there were things that, once said, would echo through every subsequent room. She chose the kind of silence that is not absence, but peace. The study at Ashmore Park had a south-facing window that looked onto the kitchen gardens, and beyond them, the orchard. In November, the trees were bare, and the light through them was thin and gray and beautiful in the specific way of English autumn light, which asks nothing of the viewer and gives everything. Edmund was at the window when she came in. He did not hear her at first. He was standing with his left hand in his coat pocket, looking at the bare trees, and his face in profile was the face she had first known at 8 years old and understood no better then than she understood most things, which was not to say that she had not known it completely, in the way that children sometimes know the essential shape of a person before they have the language for it. She set the small tin on the desk. She had brought it from her things that morning. He turned. She opened the tin. She took out the button. She held it in her palm between them. He reached into his pocket and drew out its twin. He set it beside hers. 2 buttons from a child's coat, cracked and yellowed now, worn smooth at the edges. They had been kept in separate places for 12 years, and they were, unmistakably, the same coat. "I've been thinking," he said. About the orchard. The afternoon we were racing, and you caught the button when it came loose. You told me to throw it away, she said. You said it was a button. I was 12, he said. I did not know yet what things were. She looked at the buttons in both their palms. You know now, she said. I know now, he agreed. He took her hand, both buttons folded into her palm, his fingers closed over hers, and the study at Ashmore Park held them in its autumn quiet. The fire at their back and the bare orchard through the glass, and the sound from the next room of Harriet laughing at something. A clear, unguarded sound. The laugh of a child who has decided the world is safe enough to do that in. The study door was open. The laugh came through. Edmund did not look away from her. Thomas, she said, very softly. He held her hand a little tighter. If this story stayed with you, leave a word below and find us again for the next one. Thank you truly for staying until the end.